In a remote corner of Montana, a deadly game of cat and mouse is about to begin. A powerful syndicate has its sights set on taking over a quiet ranch, convinced they're dealing with nothing more than an aging, irrelevant movie star, someone past his prime and far from dangerous. But this isn't just another story of struggle over land. This is the story of one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere, learning a costly lesson. Some old soldiers, like Stallone, a former actor and deeply trained warrior, never lose their edge. When they came to seize what wasn't theirs, they didn't realize they were walking straight into a trap crafted by a master of intelligence and combat. What follows is the tale of how one man and his elite team dismantled an entire criminal operation in just a few days, armed with nothing more than a remote ranch and a lifetime of experience. In the early days of October, with Montana's first frost whispering across the pines and cattle trails gone still, Sylvester Stallone stood by the worn fence of his newly purchased ranch in Flathead Valley. A denim jacket pulled tight over a plaid shirt, leather boots planted in the cold earth, and a ball cap shielding his familiar face from the low golden sun, he looked less like a Hollywood icon and more like a man trying to disappear. And that was the plan. After more than 5 decades under the relentless spotlight, red carpets, studio lots, paparazzi lenses, he had decided it was time to retreat, just for a year. Time to listen to silence, relearn the rhythms of seasons, and forget what it felt like to always be seen. He'd bought this land with cash, under a quiet LLC, with no press release or public fanfare. There were no cameras now, no agents, no trainers, just him, a German shepherd named ROKY, and an honest piece of earth that hadn't seen drama since the last spring flood. But some shadows don't care how quiet you try to live. That morning, while walking the edge of the north pasture with ROKY pacing loyally at his side, Stallone noticed something out of place. Deep tire tracks gouged into the damp soil just inside the property line. Not rancher tires. These were heavy, wide, with sharp treads that told of weight and speed. Not a rancher he'd met drove anything close to this. His eyes narrowed. The earth always tells the truth. He said nothing, just knelt and placed his fingers into the dirt. ROKY let out a low, uncertain growl. Stallone looked around. Pines to the north, open field to the west. No other tracks, no cows, spooked. Whoever had been here had kept their engine quiet and stayed just long enough to leave a mark. He stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands, and turned back toward the house, the old scars on his knees reminding him that while the movies had aged, some things in his body still remembered the real pain. An hour later, the sound of engines hummed in the distance, low and deliberate. Not the rattle of old Fords or the whine of farm pickups. These were smooth, deep, expensive. Moments later, a convoy of 3 black SUVs rolled up the gravel path to his gate. The vehicles gleamed too much, like sharks in a small pond. The lead SUV stopped. Doors opened. 5 men stepped out, all in dark suits, polished shoes, sunglasses, entirely out of place amid the dust and raw chill of Montana fall. One of them, a man in his 40s with clean hands and a face that looked like it belonged more to a courtroom than a cattle drive, stepped forward. He wore confidence like cologne. His name was Felix Reyes. "Mr. Stallone," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "My name is Felix. I represent a private investment firm with an interest in this valley. Mind if we talk for a few minutes?" Stallone looked down at the hand, then shook it with the grip of a man who used to break bricks in training. "You're already here," he said simply. Felix smiled, used to charm working faster than it was. "We've been acquiring land in the area. Beautiful place you've got here. Plenty of room. Incredible elevation. Strategic, actually. We're building something unique. We'd like to make you an offer. 3 million. Cash, no inspections, no paperwork headaches, just a smooth transition." "I didn't buy this place to sell it," Stallone replied, his tone calm but solid. Felix kept his smile, but his eyes thinned. "Mr. Stallone, I understand the appeal of solitude. Truly I do. But this valley is evolving. Change is coming, whether anyone wants it or not. You could be part of something much bigger." Stallone didn't blink. "I already was." There was a pause then, a real one, a shift. The men behind Felix began scanning the landscape more intentionally. One moved subtly toward the barn, eyes lifting toward the rafters. Another checked his wrist radio. They weren't investors. Not really. Stallone recognized the formation, the cadence. He'd seen it in places like Kandahar, Caracas, and too many sets that had tried to replicate the real thing. Felix stepped in closer, his voice lower. "You're a man with a legacy, a household name. But names fade? Places like this can be taken care of. We hope you'll reconsider. We don't like unpleasant situations." Stallone smiled now, faint and dry. "You picked the wrong valley for unpleasant." The men retreated for now, slipping back into their vehicles like oil on water. Stallone watched them until the dust settled, then turned and walked to the barn. Inside, behind a stack of feed sacks and an old tool chest, he opened a floor panel he hadn't touched since moving in. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and memory, were 3 things: a topographic map of the valley, an encrypted field radio, and a black steel case. He opened the case, checked the weapon inside, and closed it with a click. Some habits never retire. That night, he sat by the fire, ROKY asleep beside him, the heat from the flames softening the ache in his joints. On the mantel was a photo in a wood frame, 5 men in desert fatigues, covered in dust, squinting into sun and danger. Brothers in arms. He hadn't called them in years. But now he turned to the radio, plugged in the power, adjusted the frequency, and spoke into the mic. "This is Phantom. We've got movement in the valley. Eyes needed." The reply came almost instantly, a gravelly voice, older but unmistakably sharp. "Still alive, Sly? I was starting to think you finally took up fishing." "Not yet," Stallone replied. "Looks like I might be hosting some unwanted guests." "We're listening. Who's we?" "Felix Reyes, some kind of acquisition guy. But he brought muscle, not local." There was a pause, then a short laugh. "Say no more. I'll round up the boys." "Just like old times?" "Just like old times," Stallone said, voice quiet, but with a weight that hadn't aged a day. Later that night, he stood outside with ROKY at his side. The stars above Montana were blindingly clear. The kind of sky you forget exists when you live under city haze too long. And yet, beneath that sky, something stirred. Trouble had found him again, not in some jungle, not in a soundstage, but here, on American soil, on land he just wanted to call home. He had come to Montana to escape the past. He never imagined it would follow him all the way into the trees. But this time, he wouldn't run. By the time the morning frost had melted from the tips of the grass, Sylvester Stallone had already mapped out half the valley in his mind. Every ridge, every tree line, every spot where a man could hide or a camera could be placed. He had walked it all before breakfast. ROKY stayed close, more alert than usual, his ears picking up sounds the human ear might miss. Stallone knew the rhythm of quiet danger. It didn't announce itself. It hummed, it pulsed, it moved just beneath the wind. He was hearing it now. On the surface, Flathead Valley was still a sleepy stretch of the American Northwest, with worn barns and gravel roads, but something underneath had changed. The day before, Felix Reyes and his investment team had driven off with empty hands and tight jaws. Stallone doubted they liked being told no. Predators rarely do. And what they couldn't buy, they would try to break. Inside the cabin, Stallone sat at the table with the valley map spread open. He'd marked the previous tire tracks and made notes of vehicle movements he'd spotted in the early hours. SUVs circling, headlights killed, rolling slow down unpaved roads like hunters, sizing up a fence. He still hadn't told the sheriff, and he wouldn't. Local law was good for busted fences and neighbor disputes. This was something else, something calculated, and he knew it in his bones. He could feel it in how they'd flanked the barn, how they'd tested the land, like it was muscle memory to them. These men weren't from real estate. They were from somewhere that didn't write things down, and they weren't done. By noon, the first of the old team arrived. Reggie Hawk Malone pulled up in a sun-faded Dodge pickup that looked like it belonged to any other Montana hunter. He stepped out with a casual ease that hid the fact he'd once led recon operations deep in the Hindu Kush. A long scar curved over his knuckles, a reminder of a knife fight in Lagos. Stallone opened the screen door and just nodded. No words needed. They hadn't seen each other in 11 years, but muscle memory between brothers didn't rust. Reggie said, "Looks the same as it did in Syria, right before the shit hit." Stallone smirked. "Only prettier trees." Over the next 6 hours, 3 more arrived, staggered by design. Linda Tran, the comms and intel expert, who now taught middle school in Spokane, pulled in with what looked like school supplies, but was actually a compact drone kit and long-range surveillance gear. Carlos Alvarez, Blaze to the few who still remembered his nickname, drove up in a landscaping truck loaded with disguised cases of shaped charges and smoke devices. And Doc Wheeler, the combat medic, showed up in a Subaru with his vet license hanging on the mirror. He carried a worn duffel full of trauma kits and his old field satchel. Within a day, Stallone's peaceful ranch was quietly converted into a layered perimeter of defense. Nothing flashy. No landmines, just simple brilliance. Motion detectors woven into fence lines, infrared sensors along the south tree line, remote-controlled flares tucked into hay bales, and decoys mounted in the barn rafters to draw fire when the time came. They didn't plan to shoot first, but they weren't going to shoot second either. That evening, they met in the barn with only lantern light and hand-drawn maps. Linda ran a feed from a drone circling 3 miles out, showing a cluster of new SUVs parked behind the abandoned Miller place. 6 vehicles, at least 20 men. They weren't construction crews. No one was carrying survey tools, but several had shoulder holsters. Reggie said, "They're staging." Carlos added, "Saw similar setups in Baja when they were running supply routes through citrus farms. Soft fronts, hard teeth." Stallone traced a route with his finger. "They come through here. They get funneled. 2 narrow points, tree cover thick. Slope works in our favor. We hold high ground." Doc looked at the drone feed, then at Stallone. "You sure you want to escalate? I mean, this is your land, your name. They find out who you are." Stallone cut him off gently, but firmly. They already know who I am. And they came anyway. That's the problem. They think it doesn't matter. The next night, a storm rolled in. A real one, clouds heavy with the scent of snow, sky streaked with copper lightning. In the distance, headlights moved like silent threats across the hills. At 1:17 a.m., Stallone spotted them on the south camera. 3 SUVs rolling in low, no lights, 2 men on foot ahead of the vehicles checking the terrain. The team moved without a sound. Reggie took the sniper nest in the north silo. Carlos activated the decoy lights near the far paddock, and Linda manned the signal jammer that would black out cellular service across a 2-mile radius the moment they breached the fence. Doc waited in the lower barn with emergency triage gear. And Stallone stood by the porch, with ROKY beside him, his old field radio strapped to his hip and a suppressed Remington slung behind his shoulder. His breath was calm, focused. He wasn't Rambo. He wasn't Rocky. He wasn't any of the legends the world had painted on his face. He was just a man who had fought enough wars to know when one was coming. At 1:26 a.m., the SUVs stopped. Doors opened. The men stepped out, dressed in tactical blacks, no insignia, clean weapons, silent boots. 2 moved toward the barn, 1 toward the generator line. Another held back with radio gear. They were professionals, but arrogant. They weren't expecting a response. Certainly not from a man pushing 80. That's what made it a mistake. As the first man reached for the latch on the barn door, the motion sensor triggered a silent alert. Linda pressed a switch. The old floodlight above the hayloft burst to life, blinding white. At the same moment, a recording played from inside the barn. An old field drill Stallone had saved, full of radio chatter and shouted orders, mimicking a full team response. The intruders froze. Reggie's voice crackled in Stallone's ear. "Got eyes? Orders?" Stallone spoke without hesitation. "Spook them! Don't kill! Not yet!" Reggie fired 2 shots, non-lethal rounds, right at the feet of the 2 men near the paddock. The men bolted. Carlos triggered a smoke flare near the fence line, clouding the lower hill in thick white fog. Another figure tried circling toward the house, but stopped cold when he realized there were infrared beams all around the front yard, flashing red dots across his chest like a digital constellation. He dropped his weapon. The others retreated fast, dragging 1 man who had twisted his ankle in the panic. The SUVs screeched into reverse, tearing down the hill, fishtailing into the dirt road, gone in seconds. By 1:34 a.m., they had vanished into the trees. Stallone stood in the middle of the yard, heart steady. He exhaled, lowered his weapon. ROKY stood beside him, unmoving. The barn lights dimmed. Linda shut down the system. Carlos collected the flare remains. Reggie cleared the tower. Doc had nothing to patch. It was over, for tonight. But no one celebrated. This hadn't been an attack. It was a test, a warning, or a threat disguised as one. And the reply they'd sent would only spark a new level of attention. But Stallone wasn't worried. He hadn't come here looking for a fight. But now that it had come to him, he wasn't going anywhere. The morning after the intruders fled into the shadows of the pines, Flathead Valley woke to the kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that came after something broke. Stallone stood by the porch, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the long gravel drive, as if he could still see the tire tracks. The others had gone inside to rest, but he hadn't slept. He couldn't. The old instincts, honed through decades of conflict, both on screen and off, told him the silence was only temporary. What they'd fought off wasn't a raid. It was a probe, and probes were followed by real fire. Inside the cabin, Linda monitored the drones. One of them, silent and circling high over the abandoned Miller Ranch, caught sight of something that made her pause. 4 new black vehicles. One truck with a tarp covering what looked like heavy equipment, and a different group of men. Heavier built, less polished, more primal. One of them walked into view and looked directly at the drone, as if he could see it. "We've got a new player," she said quietly. Stallone leaned over her shoulder. The man had a tattoo across his neck, something military. Stallone didn't flinch. "Elias Vargas," he muttered, "former Special Forces, turned private muscle for hire. I worked with a guy who tracked him in Fallujah. Ghosted out when things got hot. Went freelance. No lines, no rules." By noon, the team sat at the dining table with blueprints, maps, and satellite images spread across the surface like a war council. Reggie tapped a red marker on a cluster of trees by the eastern ridge. "They're coming from this side. It's the most blind spot we've got. If they've been watching us, they know our weakest angle." Carlos added, "We need a disruption. Something to throw them off pattern. We don't hit them head on. We let them walk into what they think is victory." Stallone didn't say a word for a moment. He looked out the window, then down at his calloused hands. This valley doesn't deserve a war, but it damn sure deserves protection. That afternoon, the preparation changed tone. No more soft warnings or light defense. They began wiring key points of the property with noise charges. Harmless, but loud enough to disorient. Carlos and Linda rigged false trails, signs of movement where none existed, and several hidden cameras near the stream where the invaders would have to pass. Doc positioned medical stations in advance, should anyone get hurt, and Stallone, wearing a faded field vest and work gloves, took to the far tree line, laying out lines of sight and fallback points, every movement slow and deliberate. For the first time in decades, he wasn't playing a part. He was the part. There was no script, no cut, just responsibility, raw and unedited. That night, the sky opened. Rain fell in heavy sheets, soaking the earth, the kind of rain that muffles sound and masks footsteps. At exactly 2:12 a.m., a branch snapped near the north fence. Not the wind. Movement. Reggie's voice came over the radio, low and steady. Multiple tangos. Coordinated spread. Maybe 12. Linda's thermal feed confirmed it. 4 groups of 3, moving in formation, like a hunting pack. The team didn't panic. They didn't rush. Each person moved to position, quiet as breath. In the east field, smoke canisters were set to launch remotely. The barn had been rigged to collapse a false wall, revealing a bunker they'd dug out over 2 days. And Stallone waited at the midpoint between the house and the field, completely still, as Rocky sat at his feet, tail stiff, eyes glowing like coals in the dark. The attack came suddenly. First, a flash grenade tossed into the barn, only to trigger a light trap that blinded the thrower. Then shouting in Spanish, confused. They'd expected to storm a house, maybe rough up an old man. They hadn't expected discipline, countermeasures, resistance. As they moved forward, smoke erupted from the south pasture, obscuring visibility. 2 of them stumbled into a hidden pit lined with hay and soft netting, non-lethal, but enough to take them out of the fight. One more moved toward the front door, only for the porch to light up with red lasers painting his chest. He dropped his weapon, hands up, shaken. But Elias Vargas wasn't with the main team. He had circled wide, flanked left through the trees, silent and patient. And he emerged directly behind Stallone, footsteps muffled by the wet grass, raising a compact rifle. ROKY growled before the man was fully in view, just enough warning. Stallone turned, grabbed the rifle barrel mid-swing, and the two men collided like colliding eras, one built by war, the other by survival. The struggle was brutal, not flashy, no rehearsed choreography, just two men who had spent their lives learning how to finish things quickly. Fists, knees, elbows, mud, and breath. At one point, Vargas landed a blow that sent Stallone stumbling, ribs cracking under the weight. But Stallone caught himself on the fence post, turned back, and drove his shoulder into Vargas's gut, taking him to the ground. They rolled, fists slamming into wet soil, until finally Stallone locked Vargas's arm and pressed him into the mud, breathing hard, eyes steady. "You came here thinking I was a story," he whispered. "I'm not. I'm the man who lived it." Vargas spat, bloodied and breathless. "They'll send more. You can't stop all of us." Stallone stood, dragging him up. "No," he said, "but I can stop you." By dawn, every member of the team had returned to the cabin. 14 men had been captured. 3 fled and were intercepted by local law enforcement down the road, an anonymous tip having directed them there. Felix Reyes was not among the captured. He had never come himself. Cowards don't fight when it counts. But they found documents in one of the SUVs. Land transfer plans, shell company details, corruption mapped out in black and white, enough to bring down the entire network that had been swallowing Montana acre by acre. Linda sent the files to a contact in the Attorney General's office. Carlos erased their surveillance traces. Doc treated a minor sprain. Reggie buried the decoys. Stallone sat alone on the porch, a bandage around his ribs, a blanket draped over his shoulders. ROKY curled up at his boots. Sarah drove up just after sunrise, holding a thermos of coffee and a newspaper. "You made the front page," she said, handing it to him. He read the headline quietly. "Veteran actor helps uncover land fraud network." She looked at him, searching his face. "Was it worth it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a long sip from the thermos, eyes on the horizon, where the pines met the sky. "Peace isn't something you're handed. Sometimes," he said softly, "you have to fight for the right to rest." The town never spoke of the night in detail. The sheriff knew enough to stay quiet. Neighbors nodded more often. Strangers kept their distance. And Stallone, once the man who ran stadiums and broke box offices, became something else entirely. A guardian of a valley that nearly forgot how to stand on its own. He planted again in the spring, repaired the barn, helped rebuild the Miller place. And every Sunday, he walked into town, shook hands, and bought books from Sarah's store. No cameras, no scripts, just Montana, just silence. One evening, months later, a boy about 11 approached him in the feed store. "My dad says you were in movies," he said shyly. "You fought bad guys and saved people." Stallone smiled gently. "Sometimes," he replied, "but the real heroes are the ones who protect something, even when no one's watching." The boy thought about it, then asked, "Are you still a hero?" Stallone knelt beside him, his voice low. "I just live here, son. That's enough." And as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long golden light across the open land, the wind carried no threat, only memory. Sylvester Stallone had come to Montana to disappear. What he found instead was something better, a reason to stay.